Hi. This video is going to be about making a set of gymnast rings. So right now, this is just for size. They're about this big. This is, I think, a 9.5 outside diameter, and I'm going to be shooting for 9.25. I know, they seem kind of intimidating, don't they? They're pretty large. So I'm going to make plywood sandwiches. Each of these squares, there will be 4, I'll fasten one to the other by gluing them together and then cut rings out of it. What I'll do is use this 1/2 inch roundover bit to smooth both sides, both the inside and the outside, on both sides of each of the rings, and then hopefully that'll approximate a 1 1/4 inch thick round tube. The plywood that I'm using is, well, here, I'll give you a close-up. You can count the rings in it yourself. Okay, maybe that was a bit of a bad joke. Plywood doesn't really have growth rings. It's made of compressing lots and lots of thin layers together, but the 2 outermost layers are way too thin. This outermost layer is just a decorative laminate, and I want to get rid of it. Just on one side, I'm going to get rid of this thin layer so that I can glue it together, and I'll use the planer. The pillowcase doesn't catch all of the fine stuff, but it gets all of the rest of it. Using the jigsaw table works, but while I was doing it, my mind drifted towards other ways to do it, and I realized that I already had a mortising bit in my router. This is also often called a straight bit, very common, and this is a very simple jig that just attaches to the plate, or the base of your router, and there's a screw hole right here, which the screw will fasten to the center of our circle, and then the router spins about it just like a compass. You want to keep an eye on this because it can loosen. The subject comes up every single time, so I'll address it right now. The question is it better to cut moving in this direction or this direction? In this case, there are pros and cons to each, and in effect they neutralize one another. So really what's important is what you're comfortable with. The formal rules for this are really more like guidelines, and it's really up to you and your discretion to determine what your priorities are and how to maximize those. I've left just a paper-thin amount of material remaining. And that way I can just knife it to separate the pieces. So far it's just dry fit, and the screws help it to go back together quickly and easily now that I'm doing the glue up. I tightened the screws off camera, just so you don't think that the screws were not tight enough to draw the pieces together. Also, I label parts, and that way it really idiot-proofs things for assembly when you're in a hurry. One more thing. Tighten your clamps opposites. North and south, east and west, and then the diagonals. Doing it together keeps a nice uniform pressure, which I think is probably more important than how tight. Even pressure is key. And this turned out quite nicely, smooth all the way around. It's fairly common for plywood to have some voids, like air pockets, in between some of its layers. It just happens during the manufacturing process. But a nice way to take care of this is to just put some glue-filled wedges in the voids. Don't cram them in. You don't want to apply pressure, or you'll risk splitting the layers apart. There's still quite a bit of shaping to do. So I used a 1/2 inch roundover bit, and since I did it from each side, that gives me a total of 1 inch, but that leaves a 1/4 inch flat spot. So this has kind of a rectangular quality to it. So I still have to knock it down a good bit to approximate something round. Oh yes, I'm very serious. It takes some dedication. You have to approach it from 8 ways. You have to do this corner, this corner, this corner, and this one. And then when it's all done, you have to do in between those, which would be this way, and so forth. How do I know that this actually works? because I've already done it once. I'll show you in a bit. You might think that this would be difficult, but it's not. It's actually quite natural and intuitive. But you can see here, this is the flat spot that still has to go, and it's also up here. So naturally it just becomes thinner and thinner until it's just perfectly round like it is here. The outsides are a bit more challenging, but not much. As I've said, this is actually quite natural. It's tedious though. When you're working on these outer edges, they're not really edges, but for lack of a better term, we'll call them edges, it's hard to see them because they're opposite you. So it's easy to go a little too far, as I did here and here. It's not even perceptible to the touch, but this outermost ring is very small, so you can use it as a visual reference. I'm using wood filler on even the smallest imperfections because they're going to make aggressive contact with my hands. All of the hand sanding I'm doing in this direction. And finally we come to the good part. I'm finishing these with teak oil, but you could certainly use linseed oil as an alternative. I've sanded them. Well, first I sanded with 100 grit, and then I sanded with 220. I'm not going to stop there, though. Once this dries, I'll sand it back down again with 220. I'll recoat, and then I'll give it a final sanding of 400 grit. I picked up these lashing straps at the local inexpensive tool outlet, and they were something like $4 for the pair. They're nice and easy to adjust, and they even came with a free flashlight.